Okay, so as we've been talking about in class, things are really heating up between pro-slave and anti-slave forces. And we're seeing that play out more in a moralistic sense, but it is still too about that bottom line of what is your representation in Congress. We know this is a legacy from the Mexican-American War. You have this new land, and is this land going to be free or slave? And yes, it's about the overall kind of culture and upper hand, but it's also about how many people do you have in Congress? And if you have more people that are pro-slave, are there going to be more laws that are better for pro-slave states or vice versa? So that's what we're going to see really play out. And you and I have now talked about books like Uncle Tom's Cabin. We've gotten into a lot of this, and where we're going to see tensions really, really mount is Kansas. And yeah, like Kansas, sweet little town of, Dorothy, no, bloodbath. And of course, it's called Bleeding Kansas. That's the name. So for it to get a name like that, we know that things are going to be pretty bad. And this is going to be Chapter 10, Section 1, where it says sectional conflicts and national politics. So in Kansas, we know in the wake of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the brilliant Stephen Douglas said, hey, why don't people decide who live in Kansas, whether it's going to be free or slave? And we know that method is called popular sovereignty, exactly. So with this method of popular sovereignty, you have a population decide. And people think, wait a second, if the population decides, why don't I become the population? So stop and think to yourself, what kind of person is going to leave their life, their job, their families, like their town where they grew up in, all of this to go live in another place to make a political statement? The answer is fanatics. We're going to get fanatics from both sides. So the people who are abolitionists who move across the country to live in Kansas to be a part of this vote, fanatics. The people that are the pro-slavery activists that do the same, fanatics. And now you all have them sharing the same state. Of course there's going to be fireworks, and more than that, there's going to be lots and lots and lots of physical fighting. So Kansas becomes the stage for this conflict over slavery. And they try to control these elections. So they have different sides. The pro-slavery side was often called the border ruffians because so many of them just like swept in from the border of Missouri. And we know Missouri is a slave state back from our days of the Missouri Compromise, right? And then you have the Free Soilers, and we know later on they're going to be to the Free Soil Party, and those are people that are sweeping in who are abolitionists, lots of them from the Northeast, who are then going to come to live in Kansas as well. So first, an election is held in 1854, and when that happens, the border ruffians are armed and demand the right to vote, and you see a pro-slavery legislature elected. But of course, the other side isn't going to accept that. So you have this game of tit for tat, go back and forth between the two, and it just gets more and more heightened every time, more and more violent as time goes on. So anti-slavery forces refuse to do this, and they elect their own legislatures. So now you have two legislatures in Texas in 1856, and both think they're in charge, and obviously we're just setting the stage for more and more conflict, right? So then in January of 1856, President Pierce, who we're going to talk about as one of the presidents who doesn't do much to stop these conflicts from just accruing and getting bigger, whereas if we had someone like Lincoln earlier on, maybe things could have been totally different, but we can't play that what-if game, right? But Pierce comes out, and in a speech he says the anti-slavery forces are the, quote, rebel forces. Now this is the green light that pro-slavery forces needed. And now they're like, the other side's the rebels, I told you. So what they do is they sack and burn this capital, this town called Lawrence, and it was the capital for the anti-slavery forces. You have newspaper offices, hotels, homes, everything. Burn it down to the ground. Bam. This happens May 21st of 1856. The North is outraged, and you have tons of propaganda covering this. People make it even bigger than it is. And then, oh my goodness, John Brown. So John Brown is someone we're going to talk about a lot. And John Brown, it doesn't get more fanatical than John Brown, or perhaps it does, but he is up there. John Brown is someone who is going to devote his life to being a radical abolitionist. He is someone, there's so many urban legends about him. We're going to look at pictures of him in class. He had these piercing blue eyes, like really ice cold blue eyes. And the legend has it whenever he felt he wasn't tough enough or strong enough, he would sit down at his kitchen table and eat lemons. Like he would eat lemons like apples. And he felt that made him tougher because they were so sour, and then he was like ready for whatever fight was next. So we are dealing with a very radical person, right? And he reacts to the sack of Lawrence, being somebody who's on the anti-slavery side, in the dead of night, And he always traveled with his sons. He had a lot of sons, so they're like this roving gang, right? He goes with his sons and other anti-slavery guys to the homes of all the pro-slavery leaders. And in the dead of night, he calls them outside and he is going to kill them with a machete. And he does this. This is called the Potawatomi Massacre, and this happens May 25th of 1856. So these 5 pro-slavery leaders are murdered right outside their homes because John Brown showed up at like 3 o'clock in the morning. Can you imagine that? So this is getting bad, right? And we're getting more and more to situations where you can't like brush things off. You can't be like, oh yeah, let's get over that. You don't kill 5 people in the dead of night with a machete and just like move on, right? So things are getting very intense. As you can imagine, the following summer, war rages back and forth between these two sides. Bloodshed, guerrilla-style warfare, there's surprise attacks. The Army is not getting involved from May to September. Finally, in September, some federal troops show up. Finally, you have Pierce do something. But the fighting still persists. So you would think, thank goodness that we have our people in Washington, D.C. who are not losing their minds, right? This may be happening in Kansas, but this definitely doesn't show how the nation feels or is acting. And oh my goodness, people lose it in Washington, D.C. too. So Charles Sumner is going to be someone we're going to talk about a lot. He's a really famous congressman from the state of Massachusetts. And we know Massachusetts to be a ringleader when it comes to abolition, reforms, etc. And he gives this speech in Congress called The Crime Against Kansas. And it basically says that the pro-slavery forces are terrible, they're causing all the trouble in Kansas, everything else. So people are applauding his speech, and he gives it, and the story goes that he is at the end, like, of his speech, kind of packing his things up to go, and this congressman from the South, Preston Brooks, takes a cane in Congress, right, in the chambers, takes a cane and beats Charles Sumner so severely over the head until the cane breaks in half. What? Right? Oh my gosh. So again, like, how do you let bygones be bygones when someone has broken a cane over your head? We are getting to the point where you cannot back down from this. This is bad. This is intense. This is violent. It's happening in Kansas. It's happening in Congress. It's happening in our capital. It's happening with congressmen. It's happening with guerrilla-style warfare fighters. Like, yikes, it is getting bad, right? The North is outraged by this event. They're going to call it Bleeding Sumner, and it is terrible. And the South is pretty happy. And the story goes again that people in the South are going to send Preston Brooks canes. So by the time he gets home from this event, he has all these packages in front of his home, and they are all new canes. Like the message is, keep going, right? Sorry that one broke, but keep going. How do you back down? We are now at this incredible boiling point, and things are about to explode. Side note on Charles Sumner, which is really interesting. He is going to have such severe injuries, specifically head injuries, that for most of the Civil War he is out of commission, and he is not going to be able to kind of engage in politics, go to Congress, etc., because he has to be like bedridden. But he gets better just in time for Reconstruction. And when we talk about Reconstruction and a core group of senators that want to punish the South, you can bet Charles Sumner is up from bed and ready for the task. He is the ringleader when it comes to that, and like, my gosh, you could see why, right? You could see why. So this is going on, and it is bad. And the election of 1856 is going to happen, and this, again, back to Kansas. So we've left the Capitol, we're going back to Kansas. President Buchanan is now president, and he is just doing terribly, right? And people keep not wanting to deal with the slavery thing, but it doesn't mean it's going away. It's like if you cut your hand, and like, it's a pretty deep cut, you probably should have gotten stitches, but you're like, I'm not going to go to the doctor, it'll take time, I don't feel like doing that, etc. Well, guess what? Time goes on, the cut lingers, now it's infected. If you still don't do anything about it, you're going to get gangrene. If you don't do anything about that, you're going to have to get your arm chopped off. If you don't do that, you're going to die. I know that's very dramatic, but I see that as how slavery is being dealt with at this time. No one actually wants to deal with it. So it's festering, and it's becoming worse, and it's pulling our country apart more and more. And the politicians are either egging it on, like Charles Sumner and like Preston Brooks, or they are not doing anything about it, like Buchanan, and it's just getting worse and worse and worse. And Buchanan keeps saying, oh, popular sovereignty is doing fine. No, it's not. People are murdering each other in Kansas. That's not fine. That's not good. So then finally in 1857, you have the Lecompton Constitution. And this is going to be after the Potawatomi Massacre. The anti-slavery legislature has like won. So the pro-slavery forces formed this Lecompton Constitution, and they're like, this is the Constitution of Kansas, not the other one, this is a better one. And everyone's like, let's see it so we can vote on it. And they say, no, I'm not showing you. It's ridiculous, right? Because they know it'll be voted down. So in 1858, Free Soil forces officially reject this Constitution. Buchanan does get involved. He says, let's have another vote. And in August of 58, this Constitution is finally rejected in full. But you and I are going to talk about how this really doesn't matter, because even though they lose Kansas, there is going to be a court case that says, and that is the Dred Scott case, I know you knew it. This court case says, guess what? It almost doesn't matter which states are free or slave, because slavery can exist almost in any state. So this is outrageous, and we're going to get to that very quickly. Then the last thing I want to mention, and even though it goes into the Dred Scott decision in this outline, I want to wait to talk about that in class. The attack on Harper's Ferry by John Brown. So John Brown, disgusted with everything that kind of happens following the Lecompton Constitution, he leaves Kansas, etc. And everyone thinks that he's gone, but he's like this terrorist sleeper cell. And he actually like rents a house outside Virginia and plots this whole thing with his sons and with his posse to attack an arsenal in Harper's Ferry, Virginia. Now we know an arsenal has guns and weapons. And John Brown's plan is that he's going to attack the arsenal. He's going to get the weapons. He's going to distribute them to all the slaves who will come to him once they know that there's weaponry. And then there's going to be a big slave revolt through the South, and everything is going to kind of be taken care of. Now, other abolitionists like Frederick Douglass begged him not to do this. They said, not only is this a suicide mission, this is way too radical. It is not going to work. But we know what we know about John Brown, and he was not somebody who was about to listen to this. So he does this, plans it all summer. He and 21 other men in October of 1859 are going to cross into Virginia, seize the weapons from the arsenal, and send the word out, like, come on, let's go, we're leading the revolt. Crickets. Nothing. No one shows. So now they are stuck in this arsenal, and they're waiting for slaves to show up, and they're going to lead this big revolt. Nothing. So they are now going to be there. People start firing shots back and forth. There's this shootout. And eventually the U.S. Marines show up. And the U.S. Marines are ironically, or maybe not, led by Robert E. Lee, who we know is going to be a big Confederate general. And he shows up to the scene. He deals with what's going on. And there are casualties on both sides. They end up going in, grabbing John Brown and the few remaining survivors that were not killed from the shootout. And this is what happens when the troops raid the arsenal. Afterwards, John Brown and those few men are executed. Now, when this happens, this is a game changer, and we always see this. What somebody does during their lifetime may make them a madman, but they die instant martyr status. So John Brown, during his lifetime, people said he's crazy, he's this, he's that. Now he's executed, and when this happens, he is now this martyr for the abolitionist cause, right? And people in the North are going to support him more than ever. More people become abolitionists. People in the South are so freaked out because, again, not a lot of interaction between the North and the South, right? Not a lot of people traveling, knowing each other, etc. And they don't know a lot of Northerners. And here comes one who tried to steal weapons from them and start a slave revolt from inside. And they're thinking, oh my God, that's what they're like in the North. And the North is thinking, oh my God, that's what they do in the South. They execute people like this. So this miscommunication is just growing, and this gap between the two just widening, right? Widening. So we see this happen with John Brown. And think of, like, you know, when Whitney Houston was alive, people gave her all kinds of trouble for how she was living her life. She's dead. #1 iTunes sales the next day, right? So we see this. And now that John Brown has died for this cause, it becomes stronger. So I'm going to stop there because the next thing we're going to talk about is Dred Scott. And when we do that, I want to be in class together. But I think we can all agree things are not looking good, and this Civil War is around the corner. All right, guys. Bye.